Three riders came out of the west at dusk, and the first thing Cole Jordan noticed was that they rode in a line rather than a cluster, the way men ride when they want to be counted. He was standing at the gate of his south pasture, a wood-handled file in one hand and a section of fence wire in the other, when he saw them come over the low swell of ground that separated his 160 acres from the county road. Cinder, his gray gelding, stood ground-tied 20 feet behind him and raised his head at the sound of hooves on dry earth. Cole did not raise his head. He worked the file along the twisted end of the wire, slow and unhurried, and let the riders come to him. They pulled up at 10 feet and sat their horses in the fading light. The man in the center was broad through the shoulders, with a black hat pushed back on his head, and a cavalry-style rig on his hip that he had not earned in any cavalry Cole had ever heard of. He had the kind of face that had been handsome once, and had spent the years since deciding it still was. He looked down at Cole the way a man looks at something in his way. "Cole Jordan," the man said. It was not a question. Cole set the file against the fence post and gave the wire one more turn. "That's my name. Deke Pruitt. I work for Commissioner Alderman." He let the name sit in the air, expecting it to do something. "The commissioner has some papers that concern this property. You'll be receiving them through Sheriff Briggs in the coming days." Cole looked up at Pruitt then, and then at the man on his right, narrow-faced and still, with pale eyes that moved across the fence line like he was measuring it, and at the man on the left, younger, maybe 23, sitting loose in the saddle with his hat brim pulled low, who had not yet learned to arrange his face into something unreadable. "I've received papers before," Cole said. Pruitt smiled. It did not reach the pale eyes of the man on his right. "These are different papers." He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, the gesture a man makes when he wants to seem courteous while meaning nothing courteous at all. Then he turned his horse, and the 3 of them rode back the way they had come, single file, unhurried, south toward Calden. Cole watched them until they were a single dark shape against the last of the light. Then he turned back to the fence and finished the splice. Cinder walked up and set his nose against Cole's shoulder, warm and steady, and Cole put one hand flat against the horse's neck without looking at him. He was not a man given to wasted motion, and the question he asked himself standing there at the fence line was not whether Russ Alderman wanted his land. He had known that for 2 seasons. The question was what Alderman intended to do about it, and whether the answer to that question was going to require Cole to open a trunk he had kept locked for 15 years. He hoped it would not. He had been hoping that for a long time. It would serve some purpose before the story moves much further, to say what manner of man Cole Jordan was by the time Russ Alderman pointed Deke Pruitt at him. If you have a moment before we go on, leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe if the frontier is a place you like to spend time. Now, back to Cole. He had filed his homestead claim in the spring of 1867, 8 months after mustering out at Winchester with the dust of the Shenandoah Valley still in his coat. He was 31 years old at the time of filing, and he had spent the 8 years prior to that, from 1858 to 1866, in the service of the United States Cavalry, first in the Kansas Territory, and then under General Sheridan in the Valley campaigns of 64 and 65, where the work was methodical and the cost was high, and the victory, when it finally came, tasted mostly of ash and tired horses. He chose Custer County, Nebraska, because a man he had ridden with had a cousin there who said the land was flat and the water was honest, and because it was far enough from Virginia that he would not spend his mornings looking at the light and thinking about what the light had looked like before. He filed on 160 acres outside the small town of Calden, paid his $14 filing fee, and began breaking ground. In 15 years, he had cultivated every acre that could be cultivated, built a 2-room sod house that he had since replaced with a proper frame house, dug a well that had never run dry, planted a windbreak of cottonwoods along the north fence line, and kept a small herd of mixed cattle on the south pasture. He was 46 years old in the summer of 1882, with gray in his close-cropped hair and the particular quietness that settles into a man who has decided to stop making noise. He spoke to his neighbors when neighborly exchange was warranted. He attended the occasional service at Calden's small Methodist church. He kept his own counsel. The nearest neighbor of consequence was a widow named Nora Hensley, whose quarter section of 160 acres adjoined his on the west. Her husband, Frank, had died of a chest ailment 3 winters back, and she had since managed the claim with one hired hand, a young man named Cord Dempsey, and a stubbornness that Cole had privately admired from the beginning. She grew winter wheat on the north half of her claim and kept a small kitchen garden that produced more than she could use, and she was in the habit of leaving surplus vegetables on Cole's porch without ceremony, the way a practical woman communicates goodwill. She was also, as Cole had come to understand, the other name on Russ Alderman's list. Alderman held the position of county commissioner for Custer County, a post he had obtained 3 years prior through a combination of money, favored appointments, and the particular brand of civic generosity that tends to require repayment. He had arrived in the county from Omaha with a surveyor's eye and a land speculator's patience, and he had spent the years since identifying parcels that sat atop the likely route of the proposed spur line that the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad was considering driving through the county. Cole's 160 acres and Nora's adjacent quarter section together formed a continuous corridor that any competent engineer would have recommended as a right-of-way. Alderman had offered to purchase both claims at prices that were insults dressed as offers. Both had declined. After that, Alderman had stopped being polite about it. Sheriff Walt Briggs delivered the papers on a Tuesday, arriving at Cole's front gate on a bay horse with his hat already in his hand, a gesture Cole had learned to read as the posture of a man who knows what he is doing and wishes he did not. The papers were dressed in the language of a deed dispute, citing a prior claim filed in 1865 by a man named Harlan Voss on the same quarter section Cole had homesteaded 2 years later. The papers named Alderman as the legal assignee of Voss's prior claim, now resurrected through the county land records. Cole read them twice, standing in his doorway while Briggs waited at the gate, and found reasons to look at the middle distance. "Walt," Cole said finally, "Harlan Voss filed no claim on this land in 1865. Briggs turned his hat in his hands, slow circles. He was a thick-shouldered man of 50 who had worn a badge in Custer County since before Alderman's arrival, and there had been a time when the badge had meant something straightforward. "I know it," he said quietly. "Then you know what these papers are." A long pause. The cottonwoods along the north fence made a dry sound in the wind. "Cole, I have a brother whose feed store in Calden sits on a note that Alderman holds. I want you to understand the position I'm in." Cole looked at him for a moment. Then he folded the papers and put them in his coat pocket. "I understand it," he said. He did not say anything else, and Briggs rode back toward town with the particular slump of a man carrying a weight he picked up himself. Cole spent that evening on his porch, the papers unfolded on the plank table in front of him, working through the specific shape of what Alderman was doing. The deed substitution was the legal lever, designed to manufacture a dispute that would require Cole to either buy out a fraudulent prior claim at whatever price Alderman named or vacate while the court sorted it out, a process that Alderman's connections to the county records would stretch for years. It was a method that required a county commissioner's access to land records, a cooperative or compromised sheriff's office for service of papers, and the hired confidence of men like Deke Pruitt to enforce the outcome in the event that legal levers alone proved insufficient. 3 days after the papers arrived, Pruitt's crew cut the south fence line in 2 places and drove Cole's cattle off the pasture into the county road, where they scattered. Cole spent a full day collecting them, riding Cinder along the road verges and through the creek bottom, cutting the cattle back one by one. He counted 31 head when he was done. He had owned 34 before the fence was cut. He searched 2 more days for the missing 3 and did not find them. He repaired the fence without comment. The week after that, he rode into Caldon for supplies and arrived on the main street in time to see Cord Dempsey, Nora Hensley's hired hand, on his knees in the dirt in front of the Caldon Mercantile, with Vince Callow's boot on his shoulder and blood running freely from a cut above his eye. Pruitt stood on the boardwalk to one side, his thumbs in his belt, watching with the calm of a man supervising a task he has assigned. Ed Sutter leaned against a post on the other side, arms crossed, looking at the ground in front of Cord's knees. The street was not empty. There were 6 or 7 people on the boardwalk in various directions, and every one of them had found something to look at. That was not Cord Dempsey. Callow said something to Cord that Cole did not hear, and then put his boot against Cord's shoulder a second time and pushed him sideways into the dirt. Cord caught himself on one hand and stayed down. Cole had stopped Cinder at the edge of the scene without deciding to. His hand was on the saddle horn, and he sat very still, measuring the distance to Pruitt, to Callow, to Sutter at the post, calculating the geometry of it the way a man calculates any geometry that might later require a decision. Then he looked at the people on the boardwalk, at their carefully arranged faces, at the windows above the street where more faces watched from behind glass. He rode to Cord, dismounted, helped the young man to his feet, gave him a cloth from his saddlebag for the cut above his eye. Pruitt watched all of this from the boardwalk with his arms now at his sides and an expression of mild curiosity, as if he had not yet decided whether Cole required his attention. "You work for the Hensley widow," Pruitt said. Cole put Cord's arm over his shoulder and walked him toward the doctor's office at the end of the block. "I'm talking to you, Jordan," Pruitt said behind him. Cole did not turn around. He got Cord to the doctor's door, knocked, and waited until the door opened. Then he walked back to Cinder, mounted, and rode to the Mercantile for his supplies. He felt Pruitt's eyes on his back the entire time, and he let the man look. Some men mistake patience for weakness. It is among the more expensive mistakes a man can make. He went home, and that evening, after the chores were done and the light had gone from the sky, he went out to the barn with a lantern. He set the lantern on the top rail of Cinder's stall and went to the back corner where a wooden trunk sat under a canvas, the same trunk that had ridden in a cavalry wagon from Virginia to Nebraska in the fall of 1866, and had not been opened since the spring of 1867, when Cole had put inside it the last things from his prior life that he had not been ready to let go and was not ready to look at again. He lifted the canvas off and set it aside. He opened the hasp, which was stiff but not rusted, and raised the lid. On top was a folded piece of heavy paper, official in its printing, issued by the headquarters of the Army of the Shenandoah, and dated August 1865. It was a competition marksmanship citation, recording that Sergeant Cole Jordan had achieved the highest aggregate score in a regimental sharpshooting qualification conducted at 100, 200, and 300 yards with a service revolver, and again at 200 yards with a rifle, and that his performance had exceeded the scores of all officers and non-commissioned officers present. Beneath the citation was a shoulder holster rig of oiled brown leather, holding a Colt single-action revolver that had been converted for metallic cartridge ammunition in 1873, the last time Cole had taken it out, cleaned it, and put it back. He had ordered the conversion through a gunsmith in Kearney, not because he intended to use the weapon, but because a man who had spent 8 years with a firearm in his hand understood that leaving a weapon to deteriorate was a kind of carelessness he could not bring himself to practice. He checked the action. It was smooth. He set the revolver on the trunk lid beside the citation and looked at both of them in the lantern light for a long time. Cinder shifted in his stall and blew softly through his nose. Cole put the citation back in the trunk, but he set the revolver and the holster rig on the canvas beside the lantern. He closed the trunk. He sat on it with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded, looking at the ground between his boots. He had filed a homestead claim in 1867 on 160 acres in Custer County, Nebraska. He had improved every acre. He had built a frame house and dug a good well and planted a windbreak and raised cattle and paid every fee and obligation the law required of him, and the land was his by any honest measure that the law possessed. He had done all of this because he had decided, in the autumn of 1866, that the thing he was done with was fighting, and he had kept that decision for 15 years. The question was whether Russ Alderman was going to let him keep it any longer. He thought about Cord Dempsey's face in the dust of Cowden's Main Street, and about the people on the boardwalk who had looked at everything except what was happening in front of them, and about Nora Hensley's 160 acres on the west side of his fence line, and about the specific angle of Pruitt's casual confidence the afternoon on the boardwalk, the complete certainty of a man who has never in his professional life encountered what he could not move by force. He picked up the holster rig and the revolver and carried them to the house. The following evening, he rode Cinder to the fence line that bordered Nora Hensley's western pasture and sat the horse in the last of the light, looking across her land at the small lights of her house. He had sent a message that day through Cord Dempsey, now bandaged and returned to work with the bright-eyed stubbornness of a young man who does not have the sense yet to be as frightened as he should be, telling Nora to stay inside her house on Friday and to keep Cord inside as well. He had also sent a second message, this one written on a page torn from his farm ledger and addressed to the office of the federal marshal at Kearney, carried to the telegraph office in Calden by Cord Dempsey before Pruitt's crew could observe the transaction. The message described the forged deed dispute papers, named Russ Alderman and the specific method of the document substitution, and noted that the Friday noon rail connection from Kearney to Calden would arrive in sufficient time. He did not know whether the marshal would come. He knew that he intended to be in Cowden's Main Street at Friday noon regardless. He said none of this aloud. He sat Cinder at the fence line and watched the light go from the sky above Nora's land, and the horse stood patient under him as horses will when they have carried a man long enough to understand his weight and his particular silences. "We're not leaving," Cole said to the horse, and the horse did not offer an opinion, and that was agreement enough. Pruitt came to Cole's porch on Thursday morning, just himself, unaccompanied, which Cole took as a statement of Pruitt's estimate of the situation. He was the kind of man who needed only himself when the matter seemed routine. Cole opened the door before Pruitt could knock, because he had seen him coming up the lane from the south pasture where he was mending the fence line a second time, Cinder tied to the pasture post, and he had walked to the house at his ordinary pace and arrived at the door a few seconds ahead of Pruitt's boot on the porch step. They stood in the doorway, Cole on the inside, Pruitt on the step below, which made their eyes nearly level. "Friday noon," Pruitt said. "Commissioner Alderman has asked me to communicate that the county court has authorized a vacate order pending resolution of the deed dispute. You have until noon tomorrow to remove yourself and your possessions from this property." Cole said nothing for a moment. He looked at Pruitt's face, at the line of his jaw, at the casual position of his right hand, near but not on the cavalry rig. He looked at the way Pruitt's feet were planted, the slight forward lean of a man who expects the person across from him to step back. "I heard you," Cole said. "Good." Pruitt nodded, the same two-finger hat touch as the first night at the fence, the gesture of a man performing courtesy because he finds it amusing to perform it. "Noon tomorrow, Jordan. The commissioner is a patient man, but patience has a limit." He turned and walked back down the lane the way he had come, neither hurrying nor dawdling, and Cole stood in the doorway and watched him until the lane was empty. Then he went inside, put on the shoulder holster rig over his work shirt, checked the Colt's load, and settled the leather against his ribs the way a man settles into a chair he has sat in many times before, adjusting by small fractions until the weight was familiar again. It had been 15 years. The weight came back without effort. That, more than anything, told him what he had already known. Friday arrived clear and dry, the sky over Calden the particular pale blue of a Nebraska September that has not yet decided to become autumn. Cole rode into town at 11:30 in the morning on Cinder, at a walk, with the Colt under his left arm beneath a canvas work coat that was neither notable nor conspicuous on a ranching man on a September morning. Calden was not a large town. Its main street ran 4 blocks from the mill road to the depot, with a mercantile, a hardware, a saloon, a barber shop, a doctor's office, the sheriff's office, and a scattering of frame buildings that housed the smaller trades. Cole rode to the middle of the 3rd block and dismounted at the hitching rail in front of the mercantile, tying Cinder with a loose knot. He went inside and bought 2 pounds of flour and a tin of tobacco he did not need, left them on the counter to collect later, and walked back out to the street. He stood at the edge of the boardwalk and waited. By 5 minutes before noon, the street had gone quiet in the particular way that streets go quiet when people have decided to be elsewhere. Doors along the block had found reasons to close. Curtains moved at upper windows and then were still. 2 men who had been talking outside the barber shop remembered errands that required them to be somewhere inside. The barber's pole turned in the wind. The street was empty. At noon exactly, Deke Pruitt came around the south corner of the saloon and walked into the center of the street. Vince Callow appeared from the alley beside the hardware store, 30 feet to Pruitt's right, and stopped there, facing Cole, his right hand hanging loose at his side. Ed Sutter came around the far side of the mercantile's boardwalk, 40 feet to Pruitt's left, and positioned himself there with the look of a man who has arrived somewhere he is not sure he should be. Pruitt himself was at the center of the street, 30 feet from where Cole stood at the boardwalk's edge. Callow stood to Pruitt's right at 45 feet. Sutter was at Pruitt's left at 40 feet. Cole studied the formation for the length of one slow breath. He recognized it for what it was, an arc intended to split a man's attention 3 ways and prevent him from finding cover in any useful direction. It was a competent formation. Pruitt had either done this before or had been well instructed. "Noon," Pruitt said. "You're still here." "I am," Cole said. Pruitt's right hand moved toward the cavalry rig, and what followed occupied less time than the telling of it. Cole's hand crossed under his coat and came back with the Colt before Pruitt's fingers had found his grip. The single shot caught Pruitt's center, and he went down in the dust without another word, the way a man goes down when the thing that hits him is decisive, and he has no time to argue with it. The Colt moved right to Callow, who had cleared his weapon and was bringing it level, and the second shot dropped him where he stood at 45 feet, clean and without spectacle. Callow's revolver fired into the dirt as his hand lost it. 2 bodies. 2 shots. Ed Sutter had his hand on his gun but had not drawn it, and he held it there, frozen, as Cole swung to face him across the empty 40 feet. Sutter was 23 years old, and he had not been in this line of work long enough to confuse what he had just witnessed with something he could answer. He took his hand away from the gun and raised both hands to his shoulders, palms out. Cole held the Colt steady for a 3 count. Then he let it drop to his side, not holstered, just dropped, and he looked at Sutter. "Ride," Cole said. Sutter looked at the 2 men in the street, then back at Cole, and the look on his face was the look of a young man who has just learned something he will not be able to unlearn. He backed 2 steps, found his horse at the rail beside the hardware store, mounted without a word, and rode north out of Caldon at a pace that communicated everything about his intention to keep riding. The smoke from the 2 shots drifted east in the September air, and then was gone. The door of the sheriff's office opened and Walt Briggs came out onto the boardwalk with his badge still on and his revolver in his hand. The gun pointed at the sky rather than at anything in particular, which was the posture of a man who had waited to see which way the verdict fell before he committed himself to it. Cole did not judge him for it. A man with his brother's livelihood in a speculator's debt book makes the calculations available to him. Briggs walked out to the center of the street and stood there, looking at Pruitt and Callow, and then at Cole. "I'll need to write a report," Briggs said. His voice was steady, which cost him something. "You'll need to do more than that," Cole said. "There's a federal marshal on the noon connection from Kearney. He should be at the depot inside 20 minutes. Briggs looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in the man's face. Not relief exactly, but a partial unburdening. The expression of a man who has been carrying a weight and has just been told he is allowed to set part of it down. "All right," Briggs said. He holstered his revolver and walked toward the depot. The noon connection from Kearney was 12 minutes late, which put the federal marshal on Caldon's platform at 23 minutes past noon. His name was Harlow, and he was a compact man with a gray mustache and the unhurried efficiency of someone who has made many arrests and learned that hurrying through the paperwork causes more trouble than it prevents. He had Cole's telegraph message in his coat pocket and a warrant for Russ Alderman's arrest on charges of document fraud and conspiracy to deprive homesteaders of their legal claims, warrant obtained from the federal district court in Omaha on the basis of a broader investigation into Alderman's land acquisition methods that had apparently been in progress for some months. Cole learned this from Briggs, who came to find him at the mercantile where Cole had collected his flour and tobacco and was sitting on the boardwalk rail waiting for the conversation he knew was coming. Harlow arrested Alderman that afternoon at the county commissioner's office, where Alderman had been waiting in the particular way that men wait when they expect news and are not yet certain what kind it will be. The arrest was conducted without incident. Alderman was a man who used legal instruments as weapons and had never personally involved himself in anything that could be physically answered, and when Harlow put the warrant in front of him, he read it with his jaw tight and his hands very still, and then he stood and put on his coat and went with the marshal without making the situation worse for himself than it already was. The forged deed dispute papers were voided by the federal district court within a week, and both Cole's homestead title and Nora Hensley's adjacent claim were confirmed clear. The county land records were examined under federal oversight, and 2 additional fraudulent claims were identified and set aside. The Burlington Spur line, when it eventually came through Custer County 3 years later, followed a route that required Alderman's cooperation not at all. Walt Briggs kept his badge. The honest act he performed by stepping into that street, late as it was and calculated as the timing might have been, was the kind of act a man either performs or does not. And Briggs had performed it when it cost him something. Cole did not hold the rest against him. The world is not overly supplied with men who get the calculation exactly right. Cord Dempsey's cut above his eye healed cleanly, which he would have appreciated without requiring anyone to observe it. He went back to work for Nora and stayed on the claim through the following harvest and several after that, the sort of young man who turns useful when the work turns serious. As for Ed Sutter, the youngest of Pruitt's crew, no one in Cowden saw him again. He rode north out of town that Friday noon and was not heard of in Custer County after, which was precisely what the moment had required of him. Whatever he carried north with him along the road was his own to work out. The afternoon was long and still when Cole finished with Harlow's questions and Briggs's report, and the small procedural necessities that follow an event of that kind in a county seat that has just had its political architecture rearranged. He answered the questions directly and without embellishment, signed the papers that needed signing, and declined Briggs's offer of a meal in the way a man declines an offer that is made out of obligation rather than appetite. He went back to Cinder at the hitching rail in front of the mercantile where the gray gelding had stood the entire afternoon with the patience of an animal that has learned not to read significance into waiting. Cole untied the loose knot at the rail and stood there for a moment, his hand on the horse's neck, looking back at the center of the third block of Calden's main street. The patch of ground where Pruitt and Callow had fallen had been attended to by this time, as such things are attended to in a practical town. But the dust remembered the shape of what had happened there, the way ground remembers rain, not visibly, but in the quality of the surface. Cole looked at it for the length of one slow breath, and then looked away. He had been done with fighting wars since the autumn of 1866, and he remained done with it. What had happened in that street was not a war. It was a correction, the kind that a just world applies through its instruments when the instruments it prefers are not available. He mounted Cinder. The horse moved under him without being asked, turning east toward the edge of Calden the way horses turn toward home when the reins are slack. Cole let him walk. At the eastern edge of town, where the last frame building gave way to open ground and the road ran out into the September grass in the direction of his homestead, he stopped the horse and sat for a moment in the afternoon light. He reached under his coat and unbuckled the shoulder holster, drew the Colt from it, and wrapped rig and weapon together in the canvas work coat. He tied the bundle to the back of his saddle with the same leather cord that had held his bedroll on 100 cavalry marches. Somewhere behind him, across 160 acres of improved ground and a windbreak of cottonwoods and a frame house with a good well, the land sat in the September quiet, uncontested, his by every honest measure the law possessed, and now confirmed by a federal court as well. Somewhere to the west of that, Nora Hensley's kitchen garden was giving up its last summer squash, and her winter wheat was coming in, and the light on her quarter section was the same honest Nebraska light it had always been. Cole Jordan touched Cinder's flank with his heel, and the gray gelding moved east, into the long road home. The prairie did not notice them go. It had been there before Cole came, and would be there after, and it kept its own counsel in the matter of men and their corrections, which is the only honest position the prairie has ever held. This story is based on fictional characters and events set in the frontier period. It draws on historical context for atmosphere, but names, claims, and incidents are invented for storytelling purposes only.